Shah Waliullah Dehlawi was born on the 21st of February, 1703, in the bustling city of Delhi, during the later years of the Mughal Empire under Emperor Aurangzeb's rule. His family was deeply rooted in Islamic scholarship, with his father, Shah Abdur-Rahim, being one of the most respected scholars of the time. Shah Abdur-Rahim was not only a renowned theologian but also played a key role in compiling the famous Islamic legal digest, Fatwa-i-Alamgiri, which was commissioned by Aurangzeb himself. Growing up in such an intellectually rich environment, young Shah Waliullah was exposed to rigorous learning from an early age. Even as a child, he displayed an extraordinary aptitude for knowledge. By the age of 7, he had memorized the entire Quran, a remarkable feat that set the foundation for his future scholarship. His father, recognizing his potential, personally supervised his early education, ensuring that he studied under the finest teachers of the time. The curriculum was comprehensive, covering not just the Quran but also Hadith, the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, Arabic grammar, logic, philosophy, and even Sufism. This well-rounded approach allowed him to develop a deep and nuanced understanding of Islamic sciences. By his early teens, Shah Waliullah had already mastered many classical texts and was engaging in advanced discussions with scholars much older than him. His intellectual curiosity was insatiable, and he spent countless hours in the libraries of Delhi, absorbing knowledge from manuscripts on theology, history, and metaphysics. One of his early influences was the works of Imam Ghazali, particularly Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of religious sciences, which shaped his approach to balancing rational thought with spiritual insight. When he was just 15 years old, tragedy struck with the death of his father in 1718. Despite the emotional weight of this loss, Shah Waliullah took on the responsibility of teaching at his father's renowned seminary, Madrasa Rahimiyya. This was no small task for someone so young, but his profound grasp of Islamic disciplines earned him the respect of both students and fellow scholars. He began delivering lectures on Hadith, Tafsir, Quranic exegesis, and fiqh, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant and insightful teacher. During these formative years, he also started writing his first scholarly works, though many of his major contributions would come later in life. His early writings often revolved around Hadith studies and Sufi philosophy, reflecting his dual emphasis on both external religious law and internal spiritual purification. Even at this stage, he was deeply concerned about the moral and intellectual decline he observed in Muslim society, a concern that would later drive his reformist mission. By the time he reached his late teens, Shah Waliullah had become one of the most promising scholars in Delhi, admired for his sharp intellect and deep piety. His education was not confined to books alone, he also engaged in Sufi practices under the guidance of his father and other spiritual mentors, which instilled in him a balanced approach to faith, one that combined scholarly rigor with heartfelt devotion. This period of his life, from his birth in 1703 until around 1720, laid the groundwork for everything that followed. It was a time of intense learning, personal growth, and early contributions to Islamic scholarship. Little did he know that his journey would later take him far beyond the walls of Madrasa Rahimiyya, shaping the course of Islamic thought in South Asia for generations to come. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi's teaching and scholarly work, 1720 to 1730. The decade following his father's death was a period of immense intellectual and spiritual growth for Shah Waliullah. At just 17 years old, he stepped into the role of a teacher at Madrasa Rahimiyya, the prestigious seminary founded by his father, Shah Abdur-Rahim. Though young, he carried the weight of his father's legacy with remarkable maturity, quickly establishing himself as a leading scholar in Delhi. His lectures were not mere repetitions of old texts but dynamic discussions that blended deep traditional knowledge with fresh insights, attracting students from across the region. One of his primary focuses during this time was Hadith studies, which he believed was essential for reviving the true spirit of Islam. He emphasized the importance of understanding the Prophet's teachings in their proper context, free from cultural distortions that had crept in over centuries. His method of teaching was both rigorous and engaging. Students often recalled how he would break down complex theological concepts into clear, practical lessons. He had a unique ability to connect scripture with real-life challenges, making Islamic scholarship relevant to the everyday struggles of people. During these years, he also began writing some of his earliest works, though many of his most famous books would come later. His writings from this period reflect his growing concern about the intellectual and moral decline he saw in Muslim society. He noticed how sectarian divisions, superstitions, and blind imitation of past scholars had weakened the community's unity and understanding of faith. While he respected the classical schools of Islamic law, he encouraged students to think critically rather than follow traditions without question. This approach sometimes brought him into quiet debates with more conservative scholars, but his depth of knowledge and measured tone earned him widespread respect rather than opposition. Beyond formal teaching, Shah Waliullah played an important role as a spiritual guide. He had been initiated into the Naqshbandi Sufi order, which emphasized a disciplined and scholarly approach to mysticism. Unlike some Sufi traditions that lean toward extreme asceticism or emotional rituals, he taught a balanced path, one where deep love for God coexisted with strict adherence to Islamic law. His gatherings were not just for academic instruction but also for spiritual refinement, where students learned self-discipline, humility, and sincerity in worship. The political turmoil of the era also influenced his work. The Mughal Empire, once a mighty force, was beginning to fracture, with regional powers rising and external threats looming. Shah Waliullah observed how societal decay and weak leadership contributed to this instability. Though he was not yet directly involved in political matters, his teachings subtly addressed these issues, emphasizing justice, ethical governance, and social harmony as essential Islamic values. He believed that true reform had to begin with education, purifying religious understanding before any lasting change could take root in society. By the end of this decade, in his late 20s, Shah Waliullah had already made a significant impact as a scholar and teacher. Madrasa Rahimiyya flourished under his guidance, becoming a center of enlightened Islamic thought. Yet, he felt a growing restlessness, a sense that he needed to deepen his knowledge further. This inner calling would soon lead him to embark on a journey that would profoundly shape his future, his pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. But for now, in these formative years between 1720 and 1730, he laid the intellectual and spiritual foundations that would define his life's mission, reviving Islamic scholarship, bridging divisions, and calling society back to the essence of faith. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi's Hajj and Intellectual Transformation, 1730 to 1732. In the year 1730, at the age of 27, Shah Waliullah embarked on a journey that would fundamentally reshape his intellectual and spiritual outlook, the pilgrimage to Mecca. This was no ordinary trip for the young scholar, but rather a transformative expedition that would expose him to new ideas, connect him with great minds of the Islamic world, and ultimately refine his vision for religious revival in India. The decision to undertake Hajj came at a crucial juncture in his life, after nearly a decade of teaching at Madrasa Rahimiyya, when he felt an inner calling to broaden his horizons beyond the confines of Delhi's scholarly circles. The journey itself was arduous, taking several months by land and sea through dangerous routes plagued by bandits and political instability. Yet these physical challenges paled in comparison to the intellectual awakening that awaited him in the holy cities. Upon reaching Mecca, he immediately sought out the most renowned scholars of the time, sitting at the feet of masters like Sheikh Abu Tahir al-Kurdi, a towering figure in hadith studies, and Sheikh Wafidullah al-Maliki, an expert in Islamic jurisprudence. These were not casual student-teacher relationships but intense periods of study where Shah Waliullah would spend entire days and nights engaged in deep discussion, verification of hadith narrations, and debates on complex theological matters. What made this experience particularly transformative was the diversity of thought he encountered. In Delhi, his education had been largely confined to the Hanafi school of jurisprudence that dominated Mughal India. But in the holy cities, he interacted with scholars from all four major Sunni schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali, gaining unprecedented insight into their comparative strengths and methodologies. This exposure gave him a more universal understanding of Islam that transcended narrow sectarian boundaries, a perspective that would later inform his efforts to bridge divisions among Indian Muslims. The spiritual dimension of this journey was equally profound. While in Medina, he spent long hours in meditation at the Prophet's mosque, experiencing mystical visions that he would later describe as divine inspirations guiding his reformist mission. These were not mere emotional experiences but intellectual clarifications that helped him synthesize his scholarly knowledge with spiritual insight. It was during one such moment of contemplation that he reportedly received the outline for what would become his magnum opus, Hujjatullah al-Balaya, the conclusive argument from God, though the actual writing would come years later. The political climate of the Arabian Peninsula at that time also left a lasting impression. He observed how the declining Ottoman influence and rising local powers created both challenges and opportunities for Islamic scholarship. This reinforced his growing conviction that religious renewal needed to be coupled with practical solutions for governance and social organization, ideas he would later apply to India's context. Interestingly, his time in Arabia also exposed him to early reformist movements that were challenging blind imitation of medieval interpretations, further strengthening his own approach to ijtihad, independent legal reasoning. By the time he prepared to return to India in 1732, after approximately 14 months in the Holy Lands, Shah Waliullah was a changed man. The young scholar who had left Delhi was now returning as a visionary thinker with a comprehensive understanding of Islam's intellectual traditions and a burning desire to implement reform. His luggage contained not just the customary Zamzam water and dates from Medina, but precious manuscripts, newly acquired teaching methods, and most importantly, a refined philosophical framework that would guide his life's work. The Hajj experience had given him both the spiritual clarity and scholarly tools needed to address the crises he saw plaguing Muslim society back home, a mission that would occupy him for the remaining 3 decades of his life. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi's return to Delhi and reformist efforts, 1732 to 1762. When Shah Waliullah returned to Delhi in 1732, the city greeted a transformed scholar, one whose mind brimmed with revolutionary ideas and whose heart burned with renewed purpose. The young man who had left as a respected local teacher now carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had drunk deeply from Islam's foundational sources in its birthplace. His first act was to reorganize Madrasa Rahimiyya, transforming it from a conventional seminary into a dynamic center for intellectual revival. Students who had known him before noticed subtle changes. His lectures now wove together Hanafi jurisprudence with insights from other schools of thought, his explanations of hadith carried greater depth, and his spiritual discourses reflected the balanced Sufism he had refined during his travels. The decades following his return saw an extraordinary outpouring of scholarship that would reshape Islamic thought in South Asia. He wrote with remarkable speed and clarity, producing works that ranged from dense theological treatises to accessible guides for common people. Hujjatullah al-Balaya, perhaps his most famous work, emerged as a masterpiece that reconciled rational philosophy with revealed truth, addressing everything from metaphysics to social justice. Another groundbreaking contribution was his Persian translation of the Quran, the first complete rendering in a language accessible to millions in the subcontinent, completed despite fierce opposition from traditionalists who believed the Quran should only be studied in Arabic. This translation, along with his explanatory notes in Al-Fawz al-Kabir, opened Islamic scholarship to a much wider audience. His reformist vision extended beyond academic circles into practical social transformation. He established networks of disciples who carried his teachings to distant provinces, creating what might be called the first organized Islamic revival movement in India. These weren't just theology students but included merchants, artisans, and even some nobility, a cross-section of society he sought to unite under principles of spiritual renewal and social reform. He particularly emphasized economic justice, writing extensively about fair wages, ethical business practices and the obligation of wealth redistribution, ideas that resonated deeply in a society witnessing increasing disparity under crumbling Mughal rule. The political chaos of 18th-century India deeply troubled Shah Waliullah. As the Mughal Empire fragmented under weak rulers and Maratha expansion, he stepped into an unlikely role as political advisor and reformer. His letters to rulers and military commanders reveal a pragmatic visionary who understood that spiritual revival required at least basic political stability. Most famously, his correspondence with Ahmed Shah Abdali contributed to the Afghan ruler's intervention at the Battle of Panipat in 1761, a controversial decision he saw as necessary to check Maratha power and create conditions where Islamic reform could flourish. This political engagement wasn't about power for its own sake, but rather protection of the social space needed for his educational mission. Despite these high-profile interventions, Shah Waliullah remained at heart a scholar-teacher who believed lasting change came through education. His daily routine revolved around teaching circles where he would sit surrounded by manuscripts and students, patiently explaining complex ideas. The curriculum at Madrasa Rahimiyah under his leadership became remarkably comprehensive. Students studied everything from classical Arabic poetry to advanced logic, always with emphasis on connecting knowledge to righteous action. His teaching method encouraged critical thinking rather than blind imitation, urging students to understand the reasoning behind legal rulings rather than just memorizing them. As the years passed, his physical health declined but his intellectual output remained undiminished. In his final decade, he completed works like Izalat al-Kafa, a profound Quranic commentary, and Al-Khair al-Katha, blending mystical insights with practical ethics. These later writings show a maturity of thought that could only come from decades of teaching, reflection, and observing human nature. When he passed away in 1762, the funeral procession stretched through Delhi's streets as people from all walks of life came to pay respects to the scholar who had given them both the Quran in their language and a vision for righteous living in troubled times. The true measure of his impact became visible in the generations that followed. His sons and disciples carried forward his mission, establishing educational traditions that would evolve into major reform movements. The intellectual foundations he laid, emphasis on original texts over blind tradition, balance between scholarship and spirituality, commitment to making Islam accessible to all, continued shaping South Asian Islam for centuries. Modern visitors to Delhi might find no grand monument marking his grave, but in the pages of books still studied across the world, in the values of Islamic institutions tracing their lineage to Madrasa Rahimiyah, and in the ongoing dialogue between faith and reason in Muslim societies, Shah Waliullah's 30 years of post-Hajj labor live on as perhaps India's most enduring Islamic revival. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi's enduring legacy. The passing of Shah Waliullah in 1762 marked not an end, but the beginning of an intellectual revolution that would ripple across centuries. Within decades of his death, his ideas had taken root far beyond Delhi, shaping the religious consciousness of millions across South Asia and eventually the broader Muslim world. What made his legacy so remarkable was how it manifested at multiple levels, transforming Islamic education, inspiring reform movements, bridging sectarian divides, and even influencing political thought during some of the region's most turbulent periods. One of his most immediate impacts was through his children and direct disciples, who carried forward his mission with remarkable dedication. His 4 sons, Shah Abdul Aziz, Shah Rafiuddin, Shah Abdul Qadi, and Shah Abdul Ghani, each became influential scholars in their own right, ensuring that the family's scholarly tradition continued for generations. Shah Abdul Aziz, perhaps the most prominent among them, inherited his father's reformist zeal and played a crucial role in interpreting and expanding upon his ideas during the challenging period of early British colonial rule. The family home in Delhi became a hub of intellectual activity, attracting seekers of knowledge from across the subcontinent who would then spread his teachings to distant provinces. The educational model Shah Waliullah established at Madrasa Rahimiyah became a template for future Islamic institutions. His balanced curriculum, which combined rigorous study of hadith and fiqh with spiritual development and practical ethics, inspired the founding of major seminaries like Darul Uloom Deoband in 1866. Though separated by more than a century, the connection was clear. Many of Deoband's early scholars traced their intellectual lineage back to Shah Waliullah through an unbroken chain of teachers and students. Similarly, the Barelvi movement, while differing in some theological aspects, also drew upon his works, particularly his writings on Sufism and popular piety. This demonstrated the remarkable breadth of his influence, that scholars with differing approaches could all find inspiration in his vast body of work. His literary legacy proved equally transformative. The Persian Quran translation, initially controversial, gradually gained acceptance and paved the way for translations into Urdu and other regional languages, fundamentally changing how ordinary Muslims interacted with their sacred text. Centuries later, his Hujjatullah al-Balaya continued to be studied in seminaries from Lucknow to Istanbul, while Izalat al-Kafa remained a key reference for Quranic exegesis. Modern scholars have noted how his approach anticipated many 20th-century Islamic revivalist thinkers, his emphasis on returning to primary sources, Quran and Sunnah, while engaging contemporary challenges mirrored later reform movements across the Muslim world. Perhaps less visible but equally significant was his impact on popular spirituality. By articulating a Sufism rooted in Islamic law and prophetic tradition, he helped shape a distinctly South Asian Islamic spirituality that avoided both dry legalism and excessive mysticism. The devotional practices he encouraged, Quran recitation, disciplined remembrance of God, and ethical living as true worship, became embedded in the region's religious culture. This influence extended beyond formal Sufi orders, coloring how ordinary Muslims from Bengal to the Punjab understood and practiced their faith. Politically, his legacy was more complex but no less profound. His pragmatic approach to governance, emphasizing justice, consultation, and social welfare as Islamic principles, informed Muslim political thought during both the decline of Mughal rule and the rise of anti-colonial movements. Some historians trace the intellectual foundations of both the Aligarh movement's modernism and the Khilafat movement's traditionalism back to different strands of his thought. His letters advising rulers on statecraft became reference points for later Muslim leaders navigating the challenges of preserving Islamic identity amid changing political realities. In the modern era, as printed editions of his works became widely available and academic interest grew, Shah Waliullah's influence transcended geographical boundaries. Contemporary Islamic finance scholars reference his economic teachings on fair distribution of wealth. Peace activists draw on his conflict resolution approaches from Al-Insaf fi Bayan Asbab al-Ikhtilaf. Even non-Muslim historians recognize him as a pivotal figure in South Asian intellectual history, a bridge between medieval scholarship and modern reform. The true testament to his legacy lies not in any single institution or movement, but in how his ideas continue to evolve and remain relevant across changing times. In the bustling Islamic book markets of Karachi, where his works sit alongside contemporary theologians, in the classrooms of European universities where postgraduates analyze his political thought, in the daily spiritual practices of millions who may not know his name but follow traditions he helped shape, Shah Waliullah's vision endures. More than 250 years after his death, that quiet scholar from Delhi still speaks to the eternal challenge of being faithfully traditional yet dynamically modern, a balance he mastered like few in Islamic history.